My phone exploded with alerts at exactly 2:03 in the morning. I bolted upright in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. Beside me, my wife Sarah stirred, murmuring something half asleep before pulling the blankets tighter. I slipped out of bed, grabbing my laptop from the nightstand, and walked down the hall to the kitchen. My daughter Lily was fast asleep in her room, her door slightly ajar. I sat at the kitchen table, the cold drafts of the night air keeping me sharp as I booted up the machine. I am Calvin Vance. For 4 years, I worked as the senior infrastructure engineer at Brightwave Solutions, a financial technology company that manages payment systems for 17 major banks across the Midwest. My job description was simple on paper but stressful in reality: keep the money flowing. When our systems go down, every minute costs more than most people earn in an entire year. The alert on my screen was a nightmare scenario. Our primary data hub in Chicago, which processes real-time retail transaction data, was completely offline. Not running slowly, not experiencing minor latency, but totally dark. This meant credit card declines, frozen automated teller machines, and failed deposits across the entire region. I connected to the secure network and ran my first diagnostics. The cascade failure was spreading rapidly. The automated failover system, which should have immediately shifted the load to our secondary servers in Denver, had failed to trigger. Within 3 minutes, I traced the root cause. A routing table had become corrupted, creating a loop that choked all available network bandwidth. The failover was disabled. Someone had turned off the automatic safety protocols during maintenance last week and never turned them back on. I did not have time to figure out who was responsible. The company was bleeding $95,000 for every single hour this system remained down. I pulled up my emergency instructions and began manually rerouting traffic to Denver. It was slow, delicate work. A single mistyped command could knock the backup offline as well, creating an absolute catastrophe. My phone rang. It was Peter Henderson, our tech director. His voice was tight with anxiety. "Cal, please tell me you are looking at this." "I am already in the system, Peter," I said, keeping my voice even. "Give me 15 minutes and I will have it stabilized." "What do you need from me?" Coffee and silence, in that order. Peter knew me well enough to just hang up. We had worked together for years, since Brightwave acquired the small tech company where I had built my reputation. He trusted my judgment. As I worked, Sarah walked into the kitchen, placing a mug of hot black coffee next to my laptop. She did not say a word, just squeezed my shoulder and went back to bed. By 2:47 in the morning, the manual rerouting was complete. The transaction traffic began flowing through Denver. The system error rates began to drop, and I let out a long breath. But the primary Chicago hub was still dead. I needed to log into the servers directly to fix the corrupted routing tables. Then my phone buzzed. It was a message from Grant Simmons, the vice president of operations. Grant was the kind of executive who wore expensive suits, smiled in meetings, and took credit for every success while blaming engineers for every failure. I had dealt with him only 4 times in my 4 years at the company, and every single time left a bad taste in my mouth. His message read, "We need to discuss your contract status. Call me." I stared at the screen. It was 2:48 in the morning. I was in the middle of resolving a critical system failure that was costing the company $95,000 an hour, and this guy wanted to talk about my contract. The sheer audacity of it was unbelievable. I ignored the message and went back to work. I decided to check the server logs to see who had authorized disabling the automatic failover. When I found the ticket, my blood ran cold. The request had been signed off by Grant Simmons himself 6 days ago. He had ordered the safety protocols disabled to save on testing costs during the monthly system upgrade. He had sent the order to Timothy Walsh, a junior administrator who was too intimidated to question a vice president. I took screenshots of the ticket, the emails, and the system logs, sending them directly to my personal email address. I knew how corporate politics worked. My phone rang again. It was Grant. I answered it. "Grant, I am in the middle of resolving a massive outage. Can this wait?" "No, it cannot," Grant said, his voice cold and arrogant. "Your contract expires at 7 this morning. We are not renewing it." The words hung in the air. I looked at the clock. It was 2:52 in the morning. "You are letting me go in 4 hours, while I am actively fixing a critical system failure?" Your contract is simply expiring, he replied. Human Resources was supposed to notify you last week, but there was an administrative error. I am telling you now as a courtesy. A courtesy, I repeated, my anger rising. Fine, if my contract ends at 7, I will notify Peter Henderson that you are taking over the recovery effort since my system access will be terminated in 4 hours. There was a long silence on the line. Grant Simmons had clearly not expected me to call his bluff. He was a corporate politician, not an engineer. He did not know the first thing about server architecture or network routing. If I logged off, he would have to explain to the board why the company was still losing $95,000 every hour. What is the status of the recovery? Grant asked, his voice losing some of its arrogance. I have stabilized the traffic through Denver, but the Chicago hub is still down, I replied. I was about to begin the manual database repairs, but since I am no longer an employee in 4 hours, I should spend this time preparing transition notes for your team. Cal, let us not be hasty, Grant said, trying to sound reasonable. The contract expiration is just administrative detail. We can discuss options. I need 3 things in writing within 30 minutes, Grant, I said, my voice cold and firm. First, a formal confirmation of my contract extension through the end of the week. Second, emergency hourly compensation for this incident response. Third, clear authorization to continue this work. If I do not have that email by 3:22, I am closing my laptop and logging off. You can explain the situation to the board. You cannot do that, Grant sputtered. I absolutely can. I am a contractor, remember? You just reminded me. I have no legal obligation to work past my contract terms without a signed agreement. I hung up the phone. My hands were shaking, but I felt a strange sense of calm. I had spent 4 years maintaining this infrastructure, keeping my head down, and doing the hard work. Grant had tried to play a power game at the worst possible moment, and I was not going to let him step on me. I spent the next 20 minutes monitoring the Denver traffic, documenting every single step of my work in a clean file. I made sure to note that the primary failure occurred because the failover system had been disabled by executive order. At 3:19 in the morning, an email arrived in my inbox. Grant had copied Peter Henderson and the Director of Human Resources. The email confirmed my contract extension through Friday, promised emergency compensation at double my standard rate, and requested that I complete the server restoration. I smiled. It was not a friendly smile. I forwarded the email to my personal account and went back to work. By 5:30 in the morning, the Chicago data center was back online. The database loops were resolved, and the automated failover was re-enabled. I drafted a comprehensive incident report, detailing the root cause of the failure and including the tickets signed by Grant Simmons. I sent the report to Peter Henderson, copying Grant on the email. Peter called me 30 minutes later. Cal, this is an incredible recovery. You saved our skin. Go get some sleep. We will talk this afternoon. Thanks, Peter. The details are all in the report, I said. I saw the root cause, Peter said quietly. We will discuss that too. I closed my laptop and went to bed. I slept for 4 hours, waking up to the sound of my phone buzzing with notifications. I had 12 missed calls and over 40 emails. Most of them were automated alerts or messages of appreciation from various managers. There was nothing from Grant Simmons. I went downstairs. Sarah had made fresh coffee, and Lily was sitting at the table drawing. I took a cup and sat down, feeling the fatigue in my bones. How did it go? Sarah asked. I saved the network, I said. And I probably made an enemy for life. You already had an enemy, Sarah replied. You just stopped letting him pretend he was your boss. She was right. Grant Simmons was not going to let this go. I had embarrassed him in front of the tech director and human resources, and I had forced him to write an email extending my contract under duress. He would be looking for revenge. I spent the afternoon preparing my defense. Over my 4 years at Brightwave, I had kept detailed folders of every project, every email, and every warning I had ever sent. I had documented every time Grant had rejected our budget proposals for infrastructure upgrades, every time he had shortened our maintenance windows, and every time he had made technical decisions based solely on cutting costs. I compiled all of this into a secure folder. If Grant wanted to play dirty, I was going to be ready. At 4 in the afternoon, I logged into a video meeting titled Infrastructure Review. Peter Henderson was there, looking exhausted. Grant Simmons joined a moment later. His face was completely neutral, his professional mask firmly back in place. "Cal," Peter began, "exceptional work last night. The executive team is very pleased with the recovery time. You saved us a massive amount of money and preserved our client relationships." "Thank you, Peter," I said. "Which brings us to our next steps," Grant interrupted smoothly. "While we appreciate the emergency response, Cal's contract expiration represents an opportunity for the company. We are transitioning our infrastructure management to an external managed service provider to reduce operating costs." I looked at Grant Simmons on the screen. He was smiling his practiced, corporate smile. He had realized that he could not fire me during the crisis, so he was simply going to replace me with a cheaper, outsourced team. "I see," I said, keeping my tone perfectly professional. "And what is the timeline for this transition?" "Your contract will conclude this Friday," Grant said. "We have arranged for the managed service provider to shadow you for the next 3 days to facilitate a knowledge transfer." 3 days, Peter Henderson muttered, looking highly uncomfortable. "Grant, this infrastructure is incredibly complex. 3 days is not enough time to transfer 4 years of system knowledge. The decision has been finalized by the executive team," Grant said, cutting him off. "Cal, we expect your full cooperation in making this a smooth transition. Your references will depend on it." There was the threat. "Cooperate, or we will ruin your professional reputation." "Of course," I said with a polite nod. "I will prepare the necessary documentation. I will be ready to meet the new team tomorrow morning." After the meeting ended, I sat in silence. They wanted to replace me with a cheap team to save money. They were giving me 3 days to hand over the keys to a fragile system that was held together by digital duct tape and custom workarounds. I called Sarah into the room and explained the situation. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Exactly what they asked me to do," I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. "I am going to document everything." "That sounds very cooperative of you," she said, looking suspicious. "Oh, it is. I am going to write the most detailed, thorough, and brutally honest documentation this company has ever seen. Every single unsupported system, every manual restart, every vulnerability, and every shortcut Grant Simmons forced us to take. I will put it all in writing." The next morning, the managed service team arrived. 2 engineers named Flynn and Oscar. They were decent guys, but they were completely overwhelmed within the first 2 hours. I handed them a 300-page digital document. It was organized by system, detailing every single quirk and vulnerability of Brightwave's network. "This is incredibly detailed," Flynn said, staring at the document. "Our systems manage financial transactions for 17 major banks," I replied. "There is no room for error. For example, look at page 147, section 8.3. The Baltimore server cluster has a severe memory leak. It has not been patched because the vendor no longer supports the hardware. It requires a manual restart every 72 hours, specifically between 2 and 4 in the morning, when transaction volume is lowest. If you do not follow the exact sequence listed in subsection B, you will corrupt the entire transaction database." Oscar looked pale. "A manual restart every 72 hours in the middle of the night?" "Exactly. And if you miss the window, the server will crash." I spent the next 2 days walking Flynn and Oscar through the documentation. I did not hold anything back. I explained every single risk, every legacy server, and every potential failure point. I was the model of professional cooperation, but the more I explained, the more terrified they became. They realized they were taking over a ticking time bomb, and the person who knew how to defuse it was leaving on Friday. By Thursday afternoon, Oscar asked me if I would be available for private consulting after my contract ended. "You will have to discuss that with Grant Simmons," I replied politely. Peter Henderson checked in on us later that day. He pulled me into a private call after Flynn and Oscar had logged off. "Cal, I want you to know I fought this," Peter said. "I went to the chief financial officer, but Grant had already sold them on the cost savings. They do not understand how fragile this system is." "I know, Peter. I appreciate you trying," I said. "I have documented everything for the new team. They have the guide, but whether they can run it is a different question." Friday morning, my final day, began with an urgent calendar invite. Grant Simmons had called a meeting with me, Peter, and the representatives from the managed service provider. When the meeting started, Grant looked stressed. The dark circles under his eyes suggested he had not slept well. "Cal," Grant began, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "The new team has expressed some concerns about the complexity of the transition. We would like to discuss retaining your services on a part-time consulting basis for the next 60 days. I took a slow sip of my coffee. "I am open to that, Grant. My consulting rate is $250 an hour, with a 4-hour minimum charge per incident. I will need a signed agreement by 5 this afternoon." Grant's face twisted in anger. "$250 an hour? That is more than triple your current contract rate." "That is my rate for emergency infrastructure consulting," I said calmly. "You are paying for 4 years of specific system knowledge. If you prefer, Flynn and Oscar can manage the systems on their own. I am sure they will figure it out eventually." Peter Henderson jumped in. "Grant, given the risk to our banking clients, Cal's rate is completely standard. I strongly recommend we accept." Grant stared at me, his jaw clenched. He had no choice. He had promised the board a cheap transition, but his new team was refusing to work without my backup. "Fine," Grant spat. "I will have human resources send over the contract." I had just turned my termination into a massive raise. The first 2 weeks of my consulting contract were highly profitable. The managed service team struggled to keep the systems stable. I received 3 emergency calls during the first week alone, each time charging the company the 4-hour minimum at $250 an hour. Most of the issues were simple mistakes because Flynn and Oscar had failed to read the detailed documentation I had provided. For example, they forgot to clear the temporary cache files before restarting the Baltimore cluster, causing the database to lock up. I resolved the issue in 15 minutes, logged my 4 hours, and went back to spending time with Sarah and Lily. By the 3rd week, Peter Henderson called me with an unexpected proposal. "Cal, the chief financial officer, is furious about the consulting bills," Peter said. "We have already paid you almost $10,000 this month. I used this to show the board that outsourcing was a mistake." The chief technology officer, Stephanie Wu, agreed with me. "We want to bring you back as a permanent, full-time employee." "I am listening, Peter," I said. "A 20% raise over your previous contract rate, full benefits, and you will report directly to me. Grant Simmons will have zero authority over your position or your work. We are also putting a clause in your contract that guarantees 6 months of severance pay if your reporting structure changes." It was a perfect offer. It gave me financial security, a significant raise, and complete protection from Grant. I signed the contract the following morning. When I returned to the office as a permanent employee, Grant was furious. He could not fire me, and he could not direct my work. He was forced to watch me walk the halls, knowing I had defeated his plan. But Grant was not the type to surrender. If he could not remove me directly, he would try to make my job impossible through bureaucracy. At our next department meeting, Grant announced a new policy. To ensure operational stability, we are implementing a new change management protocol. All infrastructure updates, regardless of urgency, must receive Vice President approval before they are deployed. Standard approvals will take 48 hours. Emergency approvals will take 4 hours. I looked at Peter Henderson, who was frowning deeply. "Grant, that is going to create dangerous delays," I said. "During an active server crisis, waiting 4 hours for an approval could cost the company hundreds of thousands of dollars." "This is about accountability, Cal," Grant said, staring directly at me. "We cannot have engineers making unauthorized changes to critical systems." It was a trap. If a system failed and I fixed it immediately, I would be violating policy. If I waited for his approval, the system would remain down, and he would blame me for the slow recovery. I did not argue. I simply spent the next 2 days writing a technical impact analysis. I used historical data to show how the new approval delays would affect our service-level agreements with the banks. I showed that a 4-hour delay during a database failure would result in millions of dollars in contractual penalties. I sent the report to Peter, who immediately escalated it to Stephanie Wu, the chief technology officer. On Friday morning, Stephanie called a meeting with me, Peter, and Grant. "Cal, I read your analysis," Stephanie said. The numbers are very concerning. Grant, this policy would put us in breach of our contracts with our largest banking clients. We cannot implement it. Grant's face flushed. Stephanie, we need control over these systems. Cal is bypassing our operational structure. Cal is protecting our network, Stephanie replied. The policy is rejected. We will stick to the established risk framework. Grant looked like he wanted to scream. He had lost another battle, and his hatred for me was now personal. 3 weeks later, the Denver data center required a critical security patch to address a zero-day vulnerability that was being actively exploited by hackers. According to our risk framework, the patch was pre-approved because it had been tested and posed no risk of downtime. I scheduled the deployment for Saturday night. On Friday afternoon, Grant sent an email demanding that I delay the patch until he could conduct a formal review. I knew what he was doing. He wanted to delay the deployment to show that he still had authority. I replied to the email, copying Peter and the security team, explaining that delaying a zero-day patch was a massive security risk. Dean Higgins from the security team immediately agreed with me. "Deploy the patch, Cal," Peter wrote back. I deployed the patch on Saturday night. The system remained stable, and the vulnerability was closed. On Monday morning, I was called into a meeting room with Grant and a human resources representative named Lisa Hartwell. "Cal," Lisa began, looking uncomfortable, "Director Simmons has filed a formal complaint against you. He alleges a pattern of insubordination, unprofessional communication, and refusing to follow leadership direction. Specifically, he cites your decision to deploy the security patch against his direct order." I sat back in my chair. I had been expecting this. Grant was trying to build a case to terminate me for cause. Fortunately, I had prepared my defense. Under the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, Section 806, employees of financial technology companies are protected from retaliation when they report or resist actions that violate federal financial safety and security standards. Grant had ordered me to delay a critical security patch on systems handling transactions for 17 major banks, which would have violated federal banking security regulations. I opened my folder and placed a stack of documents on the table. "Lisa," I said, keeping my voice calm and professional, "I have compiled a complete record of the incidents Grant is referencing. You will find the email chain where the security team confirmed the urgency of the patch and the direct authorization from the tech director to deploy it. You will also find evidence that Grant Simmons ordered the failover system disabled 6 days before the Chicago outage to save on testing costs, which directly caused the crisis." Lisa started reviewing the documents, her eyebrows rising. "Furthermore," I continued, "I have documented every interaction where Grant has attempted to bypass our approved operational policies to interfere with my work. My attorney, Gabrielle Ross, has reviewed these materials. She has drafted a formal letter, which is included in that folder, advising Brightwave that any disciplinary action taken against me under these circumstances will be treated as whistleblower retaliation under Section 806 of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act." Grant's face drained of color. "This is a ridiculous exaggeration. This is a simple performance issue." "It is not a performance issue," Lisa said, cutting him off. She looked at the letter from my attorney and then at the documentation. "Cal, we need to suspend this meeting. I need to review these documents with our legal department." I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and walked out of the room. The company's legal team did not take long to make a decision. The next day, I received an email from the head of Human Resources confirming that the complaint against me had been dismissed. Grant Simmons was formally warned about his conduct, and he was instructed to stop interfering with infrastructure decisions. For the next 3 weeks, things were quiet. Grant stopped attending our team meetings and sent junior managers in his place. I was able to focus on my work, keeping the systems running smoothly. But Grant had one final card to play. During the annual budget planning, he submitted a proposal to eliminate my position, arguing that the managed service provider was now fully trained and could handle the workload without my salary expense. The chief financial officer, Gordon Briggs, seemed interested in the potential savings. I knew I needed to prove my value once and for all. The opportunity came 2 weeks later. At 11 p.m. on a Thursday, A massive database corruption issue began spreading through our transaction logs. The managed service team panicked. Flynn called me, his voice trembling. "Cal, we have corrupted records in the database, and it is replicating to the backups. We do not know how to stop it." I logged in immediately. It was a critical failure. If the corruption reached the main archives, we would lose transaction integrity for thousands of banking customers, causing a massive financial and legal disaster. "Stop all replication immediately," I ordered. "Isolate the primary databases and prepare to restore from the last clean backup." I spent the next 4 hours working furiously, directing Flynn and Oscar, verifying database integrity, and manually restoring the corrupted tables. By 3 in the morning, the system was stabilized. We had lost less than 2 hours of transaction data, all of which could be reconstructed from the network logs. The next day, Peter Henderson forwarded my incident report to the Budget Committee. The report detailed the complexity of the recovery and made it clear that, without my immediate intervention, the company would have suffered a catastrophic data loss. At the next budget meeting, the chief financial officer looked at Grant's proposal and then at the incident report. "Grant," Gordon Briggs said, "this report makes it clear that your outsourced team cannot manage this system without expert internal oversight. The proposal to eliminate Cal's position is rejected." That was the final blow. Grant had failed to fire me, failed to force me out with policies, failed to frame me in human resources, and failed to cut my budget. 6 weeks later, Grant announced a major initiative to consolidate our data centers to save operational costs. He ignored our warnings about the risks of the migration. The project was a disaster from the start. It ran over budget, fell behind schedule, and eventually caused a series of system outages that resulted in service-level agreement breaches with 3 major banks. The board of directors intervened. Grant was removed from the project, and his operational authority was stripped. Stephanie Wu took over the migration, and she promoted me to principal infrastructure architect, giving me a team of 3 engineers to manage. 3 months later, Grant Simmons quietly resigned from the company. I celebrated my promotion with Sarah and Lily at a nice restaurant. I had survived the corporate games not by playing dirty, but by being undeniably good at my job, keeping meticulous records, and knowing my legal rights. If you are facing a difficult manager who is trying to push you out, remember my story. Document everything. Build alliances with competent people. Understand the regulations that govern your industry. And never underestimate the power of simply being too good at what you do to be replaced. Thank you for listening to my story on the Payback Office. If you enjoyed this tale of workplace justice, please subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us share more stories of engineers who refuse to be stepped on.